On a chilly day in early spring, Poland seems melancholy, with its open views across the great plains of Middle Europe. It's sometimes said that this country has a sad history, its people persecuted down the ages, invaded by the French, the Germans, the Russians. Now, however, they're free to celebrate the positive aspects of life, amongst them their architectural heritage. And that includes the great house at Nieborowie.
The story of this house begins in the 1690s with Cardinal Michael Radziejowski. He acquired a 16th century manor house, which he enlarged and completely transformed. Then in the 1760s, it came to Michael Ogiński, who was the great hetman of Lithuania. He transformed the interiors in Rococo style, but 10 years later, he was forced to cede it, and he gave it to his son-in-law, Michael Radziwiłł. But his daughter, Helena, was really the person who put the magic touch on this house. She transformed it, and especially transformed the gardens, and created Arcadia, one of the magic landscapes of Poland. This is more a manor house than a palace, but its main feature is this tremendous coat of arms in the pediment, filled with military trophies. And there are these nice Rococo touches over the windows, little cartouches. And the main rooms, note, are on the first floor. But what makes it really Polish are these big towers at the corners. They used these towers in Renaissance and Baroque times. Of course, Poland is in the east of Europe. And they have almost a Mongol touch in these domes, which are like Mongol helmets, with great big obelisk spikes on the top. This marvellous vaulted hall is part of the 16th century manor house on the site, and you'd think that this blackened woodwork was 400 years old too. But in fact, it was all introduced in the 1880s, much of it done by the local estate carpenters. In the 1880s, the 19th century, they liked this tremendous sense of comfort, and they created these very masculine entrance halls. Here, we're standing beside a fireplace, which you could actually sit in to warm yourself after you'd been out hunting. It's like a chair. And it's full of these wonderful carved details, this hall. The open doors have classical reliefs painted on a pretty blue ground. But best of all, are the shutters in the windows, which have very capricious detail. These little bird-like figures with human faces with hats on. Very pretty ears of corn at the top. The other remarkable feature is the furniture. This desk was made by an Italian craftsman about 1797. Not only is it made of mahogany, it has these marble-fronted legs with lion's paws and bronze embellishments. The sides are in the shapes of lyres, and the drawers are fronted, upholstered almost, in beautifully tooled red leather. The yellow silk is new. At first, you wonder if your eyes are playing tricks on you, because it's all out of focus. It's not the exactly woven flowers you're expecting. But in fact, this impressionistic look is deliberate.
I'm not sure I believe that's right. So I thought we'd conduct a trial. If the cameraman puts me out of focus and the wallpaper comes into focus, we'll know that Marcus was wrong. But it transpires he was right all along.
The Prince and Princess slept in this magnificent olive green, white and gold bedroom. You really get a sense how the Radzivills lived in this house over nearly 2 centuries. The fireplace dates from the 1780s, and it came here when Helena first came to live in the house. But the Rococo panelling, with its rather regimented decoration, all curiously in straight lines, was imported here in the 1880s. But it was actually panelling which had been put in the house in the 1750s. So they were always changing things around. And the bed, very splendid bed, they say in the English style, was only made in the 1930s. And alongside is a very pretty boudoir, done in the French fashion with matching fabrics on the walls and also on the curtains and the furniture. All the furniture is sleekly neoclassical, beautiful wood, perfect condition. This room is most unusual. It runs from the front to the back of the house, right through the middle. It was designed as a picture gallery, but then it became a library. And you'd never know, but in the middle of the 19th century, all the books, one of the most magnificent collections in Poland, was sold by an heir, spendthrift heir. But now we have these 13 magnificent bookcases lined up like sentry boxes in mahogany with brass trim. They're full of books, and it's still what it should be, a library. And like all the best libraries, it had to have comfortable leather armchairs. Here we got red leather, brown leather, green leather, all deeply buttoned, as in a London gentleman's club. And here we are on this enormous sofa, as large as a great bed. Oh, and before you get too comfortable, Alistair, have a look over the fireplace. There's a splendid full-length portrait of Cardinal Michael Radziwiłłowski, who built the house in the 1690s.
The poor Poles have seen so many invaders come and go. What happened to Nieborowie during the Second World War?
Well, the Nazis swept into Poland, and they weren't interested in it as a historic house. They simply packed up the best treasures in 19 crates, took them back to Germany. Fortunately, the Poles were able to get them back at the end of the war. But of course, the Radzivills didn't get the house back or the estate because Poland was by then communist. But the house and estate were taken over by the National Museum, and they have looked after it very well. Not only have they restored it with great care and now begun work all over the gardens, they've looked after the contents well, and they've used the house. It's alive, it's used for events, state visits take place here. And when we came in this morning, the house was full of the smell of fresh baking. There's still a chef here to cook. Poland, of course, was the birthplace of solidarity, of the revolt against communism. It led the way. And now, of course, these wonderful houses are open again to Westerners to come and visit. And it is fantastically exciting because the Poles had as many houses as any of the great countries in the west of Europe, like France or Britain, and there is a tremendous amount to discover.
Incidentally, Marcus, how do you get comfortable in one of these?
You launch yourself into it. Sit right back. Put your feet up. A century after the Cardinal sold Nieborowie, the estate came to the Radzivills, and Helena Radziwiłł was not content with having a park and garden at Nieborowie. She created a park all on its own here, and she called it Arcadia. And of course, Arcadia has this wonderful resonance of ancient Greece. Arcadia was a pastoral province. It conveys this idea of a past, perfect landscape, almost peopled by the gods in ancient time. But she peopled it with these extraordinary buildings. In one sense, it's an English garden, full of temples and follies. But even more, it's the creation of the great romantic movement in Europe itself. It's not only full of beauty and happiness, but melancholy and death. This is the temple of Diana. It sits surveying the lake. It has a perfect Ionic portico of 4 columns, but it was ingeniously designed to look different from each angle. So at the back, it has a semicircular colonnade, and this was a picturesque garden. It was composed as a series of pictures and views, and you walked around the garden, directed by carefully winding paths, and you were taken to these views, which came as a surprise, and each one had special meanings and overlays, and it was all incredibly carefully thought out. Helena and her architect showed tremendous imagination. This is the grotto of the Sibyl, but it's actually more like the entrance to a megalithic tomb. They brought these huge granite boulders here, piled them up and made this dark entrance. And behind is the knight's house, Gothic, but in brick. In Poland, they built these Gothic houses in brick, not stone. This is a wonderful imitation of it. Do try to keep up, Alistair. This is item number 4. They call it the Greek arch, but of course it was the Romans who invented arches. It's made of these huge boulders at the bottom, more granite boulders, and then bits of brick and stone. It all was meant to look as if it had been patched up hundreds of times over thousands of years. Come on, through the arch, and it's the Margrave's house this time. And here we have the most unusual building of all, the High Priest's house. It has this extraordinary sanctuary. Guests would come here and leave offerings. And the whole building was made up of fragments rescued from old abbeys and other ancient buildings. But it was all pieced together in an extraordinary way, as if generations of shepherds and farmers had been living in a tumble-down farmhouse over the centuries, altering it, mending it, putting it together, taking it apart. All these wonderful little details elaborated in stone and tile and brick. And lastly, we've talked of ancient Greece and Arcadia, but there was also the ancient Roman countryside, the Campagna. And of course there were paintings of the Roman Campagna on the walls of all these great houses. And of course there was always an aqueduct in the painting. So Helena built an aqueduct in Arcadia, the climax almost of the whole composition. And it's this marriage of architecture and landscape gardening which makes Nieborowie and Arcadia one of the great houses of Europe.
The house at Nieborowie is southwest of Warsaw, about an hour and a half in a car. It's open daily between 10 and 4, except Mondays and the day after public holidays. The garden at Arcadia is about a mile from the house.